Good evening. Nice to see everyone. Welcome. Must be Wednesday night. Mill Valley Zen International version. Um, hmm. yeah, so here we are. We're for people, for those doing the 3-month practice period. We're about halfway through. It's almost the middle of February. We can talk maybe a little while about how it's all going. But tonight we're going to continue our study of Dogen's Genjo Koan, the koan of everyday life, and the passage that I wanted to focus on this evening is probably the most of all of the passages in this document. It's probably the most well studied and quoted, and it goes like this. And I in the meditation that we just did, I said that I thought that in some way the first part of this particular paragraph is in some way very practical, right? Pragmatic directions and instructions for meditation, for practice, for our lives. And it says, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to, this translation says to forget the self. I more and more prefer to go beyond the self. So to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to go beyond the self. To go beyond the self is to be verified by all things. To be verified by all things is to let the body and mind of self and the body and mind of self and others drop off. There is a trace of realization that cannot be grasped. We endlessly express this ungraspable trace of realization. I think for tonight, we're going to stay with, I think there's plenty here in just the first part of this. To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be verified by all things. So I sometimes translate this as to study what it means to be a human being is the study of ourselves, and ourselves meaning our sensations, our sensations and our consciousness. I mean, these are in a way, and maybe you can include in there our emotions, right? So our thoughts, our feelings, our intuitions, everything that we might think of that makes up what we think of as self. That this is the starting point for practice, for meditation practice, and for understanding our human lives. And then this next line, that in some way he's saying that there's no difference between, you could look at it either as, again, I think there's no right or wrong way to interpret this, whether this is meant to be, in steps or simultaneously, or that it's one thing. But in some way, one very practical way that I think of this, studying the self and going beyond the self, I like using the like a sports analogy, or any, or you could use a music analogy. So like if you want to excel at tennis or basketball or the piano, you study, and pay minute attention to, how your hands are moving on the piano, which fingers you're playing which notes, everything that's involved. You're studying and studying, studying. But then when you sit down to perform, you just there's this the there's no self involved. There's there's no study. There's just playing. Or again, I've been mesmerized of late by watching Steph Curry, who uh, comes onto the basketball court and practices, studies, but watching how in the game, um, there's this sense of this amazing selflessness, amazing ease of whether it's passing, dribbling, shooting, but in particular watching him with his 3-point shots, but just the way he is, and the way most players are on the court. And so I think I think this is just a way to help us to understand what this means, this studying the self and going beyond the self. But I think again, in meditation practice, this sense of noticing, following the breath, counting the breath, but then this practicing kind of, I think of it as pushing offshore, and like who allowing ourselves to move into that space of not knowing what will happen next. There's that beautiful meditation instruction from Shinryu Suzuki where he says, when you breathe out, imagine letting go so completely that you don't even assume that the next inhale will be there, that there is this profound sense of letting go. And I think, again, another way to think about going beyond the self is the practice of empathy, or the practice of compassion, or the practice of deep listening. So we may notice our own reactions, our own ideas, how we're responding, what's happening, but we're cultivating this this ability to let go of our own judgments, our own judgments, ideas, limitations, criticisms. And I wanted to read. So I'm holding this book, Realizing Genjo Koan by Shohaku Okamura, and I really like his kind of unpacking a little bit about the meaning of to study the self. And he says the Chinese character for the word study is the symbol for the wings of a bird, and the lower part means self. So he says, actually, the word that's translated as study is something in the way a bird studies flying with its parents. From birth, a baby bird possesses the potential to fly, but it must watch its parents to learn how to actually perform the action of flying. The baby watches and tries again and again until finally it can fly like its parents. This is the original meaning of to study, as it's used in Dogen's to study the self. This type of study is not simply an intellectual study, although, of course, human beings do use the intellect in the process of learning. But the accumulation of knowledge alone is not enough to allow us to learn to fly. That is not enough for us to live truly and genuinely. In the same way that flying is the essential activity that enables a bird to be a bird, studying the self is the essential activity that allows us human beings to be human. A human being is a living being who needs to study the self in order to thoroughly become human. So there's lots, there's lots there. I mean, I do think about. I was writing this morning about a relationship with a very important mentor of mine, who I studied with for many years, and there's an expression from the Zen tradition that the Zen teaching or learning is kind of passed on from warm hand to warm hand. Or maybe in these days, we'd have to, maybe it's passed on from Zoom call to Zoom call, since we don't have the warm hands. But still, my hands are warm and your hands are warm and each other's hands are warm. And that, um, uh, that there's something about interesting that this word that Dogen used for the word that he chose to use for study was somehow connected to how a bird learns to fly, right? Or how we as humans learn to find our own sense of genuine appreciation, genuine freedom from our our limitations, our limited, the ways that we criticize ourselves, limit ourselves. So it's in some way this analogy or metaphor, I think, is for flying. Learning to fly is to transform, to shift from being stuck in small self to opening to our larger selves. Yeah, I mean, in some way, the sports metaphor, I think, just barely gets at it, but it's a sensation of selflessness, of this, that studying the self and practice isn't about being self-conscious all the time, but it's about developing a kind of awareness where that includes, I think, studying ourselves and going beyond ourselves includes this sense of knowing ourselves so fully that we can let go and that we can feel comfort in not knowing what will happen, not knowing what will happen with the next breath, because in fact, in reality, none of us does know what will happen. So it's like this training in living on the edge of change and time and possibility. Maybe yeah. So the other part of that, he says, when we study ourselves, we find there is no self separate from others, because we are connected with all beings. When we see that the self does not really, so it's a sense of seeing that when we let go of our limited self, we have this experience of this profound connection, which is this, to forget the self is to be verified by all things. And to be verified by all things is this kind of profound sense of letting go of the limitations of body and mind. So I think I'm going to stop there, and let's move right into small groups in which we explore this these instructions, this idea, this practice of studying the self going beyond the self and the experience of connection with the human tribe, the tribe of life, and with everything in a profound way.